Good morning. First, a question. Is there anybody here from Ghana? No Ghana? Good luck in the first World Cup match.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Two quick caveats. First of all, I'm an American, and I'm speaking to Africans. Here in America, in the United States, I'm considered an African expert. Here in this room, I'm an Africa amateur, please. And I have a lot to learn from you as well. I have spent the last 35 years studying nothing but Africa, pretty much, and I have lived in Africa for many years, but this is a different audience. Second caveat, and just as important, feel free to argue with me when you ask questions at the end of this talk. I tell everybody if I didn't like to argue, I would not still be married. So I'll be happy with very difficult questions. So what I have to say is going to be a nice takeoff from what you just heard. You just heard about redefining what we mean by security from the national security paradigm to the humanitarian security paradigm. I'm going to go through a bunch of slides really fast, so just background. I'm not going to talk about them and get to the meat of my argument. The meat of my argument is that although I accept the argument that we need to move from a national security paradigm, protecting states from other states, to a human paradigm, that in fact, this is something of a false dichotomy. So now that we've been able to redefine what we mean by security, we've moved beyond that old-fashioned Westphalia sense of security, I'm going to argue that we have to start thinking about how these two things go together, because they do go together. And I will conclude that if you buy my argument that human security and national security are not as inseparable as people think, that indeed the best approach, as the last line on the last slide said, is to take a regional approach. So first, some really quick slides. You already heard about this. We're talking here about responsibility to protect and the growing importance of this international norm to security around the world, but I think in particular to African security. This is really actually nothing new. In America, we didn't use the term R2P, but the first introduction really of human security into the national security debate within the United States was with Bush Sr. At the end of the Cold War, the United States inherited this huge military apparatus and had no enemy. It was a propitious moment to think about security in a new way. And briefly, and I'm going to emphasize very briefly, we thought about security in a different way. And you can read these quotes on your own later on. I didn't want to spend too much. But this redefinition of national security in the American debate came to a screeching halt with Mogadishu, Somalia, and Black Hawk Down. Right? Somalia was, from the American perspective, seen as a disaster. It led to President Clinton introducing PDD 25. What did this do? This practically gutted, eviscerated the notion of human security. If you read through this, it says here, the operation would advance U.S. interests and whether there was a clear threat to international security. Well, that's the antithesis of the humanitarian approach to security, right? The humanitarian approach to security moves beyond protecting the nation state and existential threats to the United States. When should the United States act if there isn't an existential threat to our being? Clinton redefined it. It leads, and I'm going to give two case studies to show you how closely humanitarian security and national security actually linked. The first case study is the most famous, of course, it's Rwanda. If you remember the Rwanda case, the United States refused to get involved. We refused to get involved because President Clinton believed that we'd be pulled into another Somalia-like situation. This was a humanitarian crisis, PDD 25, with no clear existential threat to the United States, no clear national security threat to the United States. So he redefined humanitarian missions so narrowly that it was almost impossible to get in. But there was a catch-22 here, which everybody in this room probably knows. If it indeed is a genocide, we signed the Genocide Convention. We're not allowed to sit on our hands and do nothing if it's a genocide. So Samantha Powers wrote a great article about this. She interviewed a lot of people. And inside the inner circle of the Clinton White House, and Susan Rice was at the time Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, they were directed not to use the word genocide when talking about what was going on in Rwanda. Do not use this word. Because if you use this word, you're admitting openly it's a genocide, and we'll have to do something, and we don't want to do anything. It got so bad that Samantha Power quotes one Department of Defense or state official as saying, well, what's going on in Rwanda is genocide-like behavior. And the reporter was smart enough to ask, well, how is that different than genocide? And he said, I don't know. Okay. But my problem isn't with the idea that there was a genocide going on in Rwanda, because we all know there was a genocide going on in Rwanda. At this point, I usually ask my audience, but not you, how many people died in genocide in Rwanda? People get it right away, 800,000 say. And then I talk about the first Great War in Africa in the Eastern DRC. And I say, how many people died due to the war in the DRC? And I've given this talk and asked this question 100 times. And I think I've gotten one person that got the answer anywhere near correct. And you know the answer. We debate how many fatalities are due to the war in the Eastern DRC. But let's just say 5 million. And then people go, what? 5 million people died in that war, the Great War, Africa's first Great War? And I said, yes. They have no idea. I said, here's why you don't have any idea. Because you treat the humanitarian crisis, the genocide, as something separate from the war in the Eastern DRC. The genocide is a humanitarian crisis. There's no question in my mind or anybody else's mind about that. The problem is, and you know the dates, and you know the history as well as I do, most of you, the problem is the genocide of 1994 was embedded in a long-running regional conflict. It's not a discrete event that happened in a vacuum separate from war that's been going on in that part of the world for a long time. So the problem that the administration had was defining what was going on in 1994 as a discrete humanitarian crisis, when in fact it was part of a strategic crisis in the Great Lakes region. Now the United States is involved, as you know, and we're spending a lot of resources. And we have a UN force, and we have an EU force. All of this could have been stopped if we had realized that the genocide was not just a genocide, but part of a much larger war. You know the staging. This is just the history of the conflict. I look at the conflict, which I know you know well. The actors. One of the biggest problems that I see for African conflicts is if you don't get in early, we were talking about this upstairs earlier, if you don't get into these conflicts in the first few minutes of the conflicts, they spread. There's a multiplication of insurgencies, and they spread across borders. They become redefined as something central to a state, to what is, without a doubt, a regional problem. You know all the actors. I tell people, I apologize if I'm not up to date, but every time I go to the newspaper, I have to, or a database, I have to update these actors. Libya. Libya is the second case of addressing a regional problem as a humanitarian crisis and not understanding the strategic context. In this case, same problem, opposite result of the first case. In the Rwanda case, we don't act and indirectly or directly contribute to a regional war. In the second case, we do act and indirectly or directly contribute to a regional war, right? Both cases, the central problem is not understanding the connection between humanitarian crisis and strategic context. This is a long story, but it's kind of funny. 2011, I had the girls beat the boys. This is a true story, because as the Obama administration debated whether or not we should go to Libya, Samantha Powers at the top, Susan Rice at the bottom, Hillary Clinton down at the bottom right, all thought that we should get involved in what was a pure R2P mission. General Jones at the left, head of the National Security Staff, and Secretary of Defense Gates thought we shouldn't get in. We got in. It was a humanitarian mission to stop what we considered a human slaughter. The girls beat the boys on this one. This is just an explanation of what we did. There's little controversy, I believe, you can argue with me, that this was not anything but responsibility to protect. We did not have a serious strategic interest in Libya at the time. Right? We really got in there because we thought it was a great example of how to promote this evolving norm. I believe, not everybody agrees with me, that Barack Obama, when he ran for the presidency the first time, spoke pretty openly about trying to move us away from this old national security paradigm, state versus state, into more of a humanitarian R2P approach. I believe that's where he wanted to go. I'm really sure Susan Rice and Samantha Powers wanted to go in that direction. This seemed to be an ideal opportunity to invoke the R2P norm and do something good. Yeah, except, all right? Except we didn't understand the strategic context. And I'll give you one short story to summarize this. Not more than 9 months after this, I was giving a talk at the Army War College up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Some of you probably spent time there or will. And we had a very bright military officer from Mali. And he asked me this simple question after my talk. Didn't you realize after you overthrew Gaddafi that forces loyal to him would spill across borders and destabilize the neighbors and maybe lead to the demise of the Malian government? And I said, yes, I did realize it, but the government didn't realize it. Africanists, everybody at this table, everybody here realizes it. There's only one hard rule about African conflicts. They will spread, right? The notion that you can seal these hermetically within one geographically defined state, to me, doesn't work, never has. So this is just a history of what happened in Mali. Mali's just a really poignant example because, as you know, at the time of the coup, it was being held up to the international community as a paradigm of African democracy. Everything looked and worked the way it should there. The problem with this is, and we were talking about this today too, is that in some places, as long as you look the way you're supposed to look, you have a government, you have a parliament, you have a president, you have an election, everything's okay. Well, obviously things weren't that okay in Mali if they could fall apart that quickly. So Mali fails. As it fails, it spreads. This is an old slide. I could update this slide, but we know it's slid. The conflict in Mali, which really started in Algeria probably, spreads to Libya, spreads to Mali, goes to Niger. You can look at the different groups, is now, of course, a regional conflict. This conflict can't be contained within one single state. So we start out on what's called a humanitarian mission, right, to protect the Libyan people from a terrible ruler, and it was. But we actually inadvertently, I would argue, made things worse, right, by misunderstanding the connection between national security and human security. Now we have a regional security problem on our hands. Many actors, and of course these actors proliferate even as we sit here. So what about Nigeria? I don't know the answer to this. Like everybody in this room, I'm following what's going on in Nigeria very closely. But again, this is the American perspective. I have a 15-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old daughter. I'm horrified that 276 schoolgirls were captured. I taught middle school in Africa for 2 years in Zambia at a boarding school. I can literally, in my mind, picture that happening to my boarding school. But the notion this is only about saving 276 girls is wrong. I was asked on BBC last week whether I thought we'd be able to get these girls back or not, what would happen, and I didn't have a good answer. I did say this: it bothers me that it takes kidnapping 276 girls in northeast Nigeria to pay attention to the security situation of the Trans-Sahel. This is a horrible event, and that it brought attention to a regional security complex that we need to pay attention to is good. But yet again, we seem to be laser focused on this humanitarian mission, which it is, which we should be, without really coming to grips with the larger strategic perception. So where do we act and why? I'll leave that open-ended. There are humanitarian crises everywhere in the world. Here are just a few of them. I had Putin down there at the bottom right. This is when he invaded Crimea, because he's hugging a dog, so he must be a very nice man. So how could he be a bad guy? My students like that. I have Boko Haram right in the middle. These are all examples of places that are being ruled by what we would consider probably not good men, that maybe the United States or the West or somebody else should get involved. Where and when do you get involved is not an easy question to answer. Sierra Leone may provide a model. The Brits went into Sierra Leone and lost no troops. And probably, if they didn't change the course of that horrible war, which began really in 1989 with Charles Taylor crossing into Liberia, if it wasn't for the Brits, maybe that wouldn't have ended. They went in there, lost no soldiers, some were kidnapped and later released. That was a successful R2P mission and did stabilize the region a little bit. So, implications for strategic leadership. I'd like to talk about what I call the regional security paradox. I agree with the last line in the previous presentation. The most important thing about moving from a national security paradigm to a humanitarian paradigm to me is reconceptualizing and thinking about conflict in new ways. And that means these conflicts are regional. They're not state versus state. As you know, there's little, almost no war between states in Africa. A lot of these wars aren't even civil wars anymore, really. These are what I call, in my writing, wars across states. They spread across states. How do you deal with them? Well, if it's a regional problem, you need a regional solution. That means states within the regional economic communities and the standby brigades have to learn how to cooperate. But I think it's more challenging than this, and I'm going to push the envelope a little farther than you can push back on me. My problem with the regional economic cooperation agreements, the regional groupings, is that they're made up of states. And at the end of the day, when they vote to act, it's each leader of each state voting to do something that's in the best interest of their state. They're not necessarily voting for what's in the best interest of the region overall. The regional security paradox is this. Africans are asked to join or create these regional organizations. They are asked to cede sovereignty, give some of their authority, maybe even some of their power, to these regional organizations. The problem is, in my mind, again, you can push back on me, that many times the same state that's being asked to give away some of their sovereignty, give away some of their decision-making to these regional organizations, aren't fully in control of their country anyway, especially in the far periphery of these countries. So the paradox is this. We're asking countries to cede authority that they might not even thoroughly have yet. The European Union, which has moved the farthest towards integration, firmly established their sovereignty over the demarcated boundary and the people that live within those boundaries before they went to the next step and ultimately created the European Union. We're asking Africa to leapfrog over 100 years, or maybe 50 years, right? And go right to ceding authority that maybe they're not so secure in the first place. Second problem with this to me is, and I know you know this, but this is a mess. Which regional organization do you use? If you think about this part of Africa, I'm focusing on now the conflict in Mali and Boko Haram. If you think about all the countries that are affected by this conflict, and there's a lot of them, there is not one regional organization that is inclusive of all those countries, right? ECOWAS, Community of Sahel-Saharan States, Economic Community of Central African States, Arab-Maghreb Union. All these countries have overlapping memberships. None of them include every country involved. So if the United States is supposed to cooperate with a region and with a regional organization, which regional organization is it that we cooperate with? There's no clear answer. That's it.
Thank you very much.